Gonna be honest, as much as I like shooters, I'm not really much of a single-player shooter kind of guy. Most of the time, I vastly prefer multiplayer shooters. I usually find non-competitive shooters to be a bit too basic and uninteresting with the game design, so I think it means quite a bit when I say that the modern Doom games are not only some of the best single-player shooters I've ever played, but really some of the best action games in general. And I'm not even a fan of, like, the Doom series historically. Like, I've tried playing all the old games, but I could never really get into them. They're pretty repetitive, and I just bounced off them. But when 2016 came out, I picked it up brand new, and I friggin' loved it. And what this game has that a lot of other single-player shooters don't for me is that it's a playground, it's a skate park. A lot of single players in other shooters, especially ones that are grounded in realism, don't offer you a lot of tools to mess around with, and the way to conquer most of the obstacles is fairly straightforward. Especially if it's like a cover-based shooter with regenerating health, then a lot of the combat encounters can boil down to walk into the room, get in cover, click on all the dudes' heads until you win, and then move on to the next combat encounter. But here in Doom, you're not gonna get away with that. The enemies are way too aggressive. That's actually one of my favorite things about this game. The enemy AI is exceptionally good. Even the most basic of enemies do not just stand around and occasionally shoot at you. They are constantly running all around the arena, climbing up and down things, trying to flank around to your sides and get behind you all the time. And because of that, you need to be on the move constantly, and with this game having no regenerating health, there's no looking for safe spots, for areas where you can get away from the danger and let things cool down. In fact, the game's design actually encourages the opposite. When you're at low health, that's when you want to get in there the most to kill enemies, because they're what drop your health pickups. And of course you have the glory kill, which everyone made a big deal of when this game first came out. When enemies are at low health, you can do these executions on them that makes them drop even more health. And you also have the chainsaw, which killing enemies with this causes them to drop ammo. And what these things mean is that everything you need to stay alive and fight is contained inside the enemies, and they're like piñatas that you gotta break open to get the stuff you want. And what this does for the combat design of the game is it encourages the player to always be in the heat of battle as much as possible, which keeps the intensity and the speed of the fight at the maximum level the entire time. And on top of that, you also have enemy attacks that can be dodged, because a lot of single-player shooters will have either hit scan or just projectiles that are way too fast for you to do anything about. So the enemies can basically just instantly do damage to you if they have line of sight to you, and that's what usually forces players into cover in those kinds of games. But in these Doom games, all the projectiles come at you at slow enough of a speed that you can see them, you can react to them, you can avoid them. All the melee enemies have ways for you to dodge and get around their attacks. Keeping yourself alive to survive these fights is much more active and requires you to pay way more attention to the enemies and think about what they're doing, when they're gonna do it, and of course considering the entire battlefield around you, because you don't want enemies surrounding you, you generally don't want stuff behind you because you can't dodge what you can't see, so you're constantly moving around, constantly dodging, constantly looking for what the enemies are trying to do and trying to stop them or kill them before they can do it. It's just an extra layer of game on top of what you get in most shooters of, you know, using your guns, killing the enemies, aiming for targets. You know, that fun is just amplified because you're doing that at the same time as this very interesting dodging puzzle. Plus, then you have other layers on top of that to consider as well, such as your resource management, because you don't get that much ammo in this game for the majority of it. And that forces the player to be pretty adaptable based on their resource situation, because you got a lot of guns in this game, many of which using different ammo types. So if you rely on one or two guns too much, they're going to run out, and you're going to be forced to switch to a different weapon. Which is why I generally find it good practice to be switching weapons a lot in this game, so that way your expenditure of ammo is spread across all your different ammo types, all your different weapons. And thankfully that's not something that gets annoying in any way, because all the weapons in this game are really fun to use, they're really good, and they're also very versatile thanks to the weapon mods. Each weapon is basically 3 in 1, because you have the base fire, and then 2 additional functions that you can swap between, and I really like that, similar to old school shooters, this game lets you carry all the weapons at once, because that gives you the maximum number of options. Because while the ammo is relatively limited in this game, it's not so much that you can't find your preferences of what you like to use and just focus in on those things most of the time. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it gives room and openness for players to find their own playstyle. But giving the player all the options at once opens up another playstyle, the playstyle that I like to use, one in which you try to take advantage of every tool as much as you can. Because if you really wanted to in this game, you could just use the super shotgun most of the time and blow everything away, and that would mostly work. But personally, I could never play like that because 1, I think that's really lame, but 2, as a player that's always looking for greater optimization, I see inefficiencies in that playstyle because when you fire the super shotgun, you gotta reload it, and in that time, you ain't doing anything, you're not dealing any damage, your DPS is falling. And I see an opportunity there to do more, because you can fire the super shotgun and then during the reload, switch to your rocket launcher and then shoot that. But then there's a gap between how frequently you can shoot rockets, and I don't want to wait on that either, so then I switch to the plasma sniper and I fire that. But then that's got a firing gap too, so in between shots I throw a grenade, and then after firing again, I switch over to my plasma rifle, shoot some shots, and then do the heat blast. But the heat blast then has a cooldown on it, and I can't use it, so then I switch back over to the super shotgun, fire that again, switch over to the combat shotgun, use the grenade launcher on that, that has another cooldown, so I switch over to my machine gun, fire that for a while, and so on and so on and so on. I'm always ping-ponging around the weapon wheel, trying to use everything as much as I can to up my damage output, but also spread my ammo usage across my entire arsenal, and also just because it's really fun. And it gives you a lot more to think about because the weapons are so versatile. You can use just about everything in nearly every situation, but it's about what's the best weapon to use for this situation, what would be slightly more efficient, what would kill things a little bit better. But also a part of it is I'm just trying to kind of be stylish and just go, I haven't used this weapon in a while, so I'm going to switch to that. I haven't used that weapon mod in a while, I'm going to switch off and use this for a little bit. And having all this to think about in my mind makes fighting so much more engaging, because I'm not just going, shoot the guys, you know? Though even then, just shooting the guys has quite a bit to it as well, because every tool has some quirk to consider to really get the most out of it. Like the chainsaw, as I said before, it's your tool for getting ammo, but it can also insta-kill an enemy, and it has multiple charges on it that creates a decision about how you want to use it. Do you want to take out lots of small guys for lots of ammo, or do you want to use many charges to take out one big guy for less ammo overall, but you just got a big threat out of the fight? In fact, the chainsaw animation itself and glory kills make you invincible temporarily, so you can even use that. I have many a times locked myself into these animations just to avoid attacks I couldn't otherwise, or use it to cut an enemy attack off. They're about to hit me, and I chainsaw them to interrupt their attack and save myself. Even the BFG, the kill everything weapon, still has some considerations to using it as well as possible, because it shoots out this big green orb that slowly moves forward and zaps everything that's close to it. So the best way to utilize it is to fire it in such a way that will have the most travel distance across the center of the fight that's most densely packed with enemies, so it can hit all of them. But you can also just shoot it directly at something to instantly kill whatever it is. So it's like, what's the priority? What do you really want to focus on taking out? Every weapon in the game has this level of thought that needs to go into it if you really want to utilize it well. Plus, you also have to consider the arenas themselves, because navigating them is not mindless. All the arenas in this game are really, really well designed. I was actually surprised coming back to this game after so many years how much I remembered so many of the arena layouts. It almost ends up feeling like a little bit of a 3D platformer, because you got a lot of verticality, a lot of elevated platforms that you're jumping and climbing around onto. You have all the pickups spread around the arena, the power-ups, the ammo, the health that motivates you to move around the entire space. It's all really well done, and it gives you something to think about. That's the thing that really makes Doom 2016 for me. You have all these different layers of the game piled on top of each other, and all of them require quite a bit of consideration to play this game well. There is so much more here than just about any other single-player shooter I've ever played. It is so much fun. Additionally, I really want to praise this game's progression system, as I think it has some of the best progression you could possibly want out of an action game, because action games are about just that, the action, yet when it comes to progression in a lot of action games, especially action RPGs, they mess around with a lot of systems that don't influence the action itself very much. Things like XP, leveling up, health upgrades, damage upgrades, stuff like that doesn't really affect the action of the game. If you have a certain gun and you're shooting enemies with it, but then you get a damage upgrade, what's really changed? Nothing. You use it in the exact same way. You shoot the enemies with it, but now they die more quickly. All that's done is make the game easier, but in most cases it doesn't even really do that because a lot of games then raise enemy health to match this new value, so it effectively just lets you keep up with the enemies and stay in place, and nothing is really changing. To me, it can often feel like artificial fake progression, where they try to get my monkey brain excited because the numbers are going up, but it's not really affecting the game in a meaningful way. Whereas in Doom, while you do have, some health upgrades and stuff in here, most of the upgrades give you practical things that affect what you actually do in the combat encounters. You don't really level up in Doom. You don't become stronger. You level sideways. You get more options, more tools, more ways to fight, and thus more things to think about and new opportunities opening up to you as you play through the game. At the start, you just have the basic shotgun, but then you get your first weapon mod, and now you have a grenade launcher with it. Then you get your next weapon, and now you have 3 tools, and you get weapon swapping in there. Then you get a grenade that you can start throwing, and incorporating the cooldown as something that you think about. Then you start to get upgrade points that you can spend on your weapons to, again, change how they practically function in meaningful ways. Take the plasma rifle, for example. You can get an upgrade for it where it now has a whole new mechanic where it builds up heat as you fire it, and then you can hit alt fire to expend that heat in a big explosion around you, and the more heat you have built up, the more damage it does. Upgrades to this heat blast don't just make it do more damage, it makes it so that you can fill your heat more quickly. It upgrades the maximum capacity of heat so that way you can do more damage by using the weapon more. You can reduce the cooldown after doing the heat blast so you can start charging and use it again more frequently. These upgrades change the way you use and think about using the weapon, which is so much more interesting than just stat upgrades. And you have the same kind of progression available for all the weapons and all their weapon mods, which helps even more to keep the combat really fresh. Not only are you fighting in new arenas as you progress through the game and fighting new enemies as you get further, but the way you fight them is constantly evolving. And this also means the player has a lot of time and agency to come to terms with the full toolset here. If they just gave you everything fully upgraded from the beginning of the game, you'd be like, overwhelmed by all of your tools. But by doling them out one at a time, and oftentimes giving you the option of what upgrade you want to get, you are actively choosing what you want and why, and then thinking about this new tool and how you can incorporate it into your already existing arsenal. This right here is how you do progression in an action game. Don't just make the numbers go up, change the action itself. And I think that Doom 2016 does that incredibly well. And all this progression stuff works to motivate the player to engage with the game fully, because of course you want all these upgrades are going to make you stronger, but to get these upgrades, you gotta explore around the levels, find collectibles, engage with all the optional challenges, and do these little side objectives. The pacing of it actually reminds me a lot of survival horror games, where you got kind of 2 tones to the gameplay, the high-intensity combat, and then the more chill exploration and navigating the stages. And in that period, you're trying to look for resources and anything you can to give you the best fighting chance possible. And actually, another game that I get very similar vibes to here is Metroid Prime. Especially early on when you have very limited options, and like the way the level design is done with this game, where you have these kind of mazy levels where you gotta find key cards and then go back to areas you've been before, and that opens up new areas, you find new weapons. Even at the beginning of the game, don't have the double jump, and you find that, and then that opens new areas to you. Even the fact that the whole thing is first person, and like the in-game HUD is supposed to be Doom Guy's HUD in his visor, feels very, very Metroid Prime in many ways. I don't know if it's an intentional influence, but it feels fairly similar in a number of ways, and it honestly makes me wish that Metroid Prime would take a few cues from Doom, because these games are so awesome. But of course, this game has some problems, some things about it that I don't really love. Collectibles actually being one of those things. For the most part, I think they're okay, but it can get a bit annoying sometimes, because there's lots of collectibles to find. You can have pretty sizable gaps in between the fighting where you're like searching around for stuff, because, you know, you want to get all the upgrades, you want to get that 100% completion, get everything you can, and that means sometimes you're like, how the fuck do I get here? And you're wandering around for a while, getting kind of frustrated, and it's like, I just want to go back to shooting demons, but this is really valuable for me to be doing. I've talked about this before on my channel. Collectibles in linear games is something that I'm not usually the biggest fan of because it kind of distracts from the core gameplay. I want to just go forward and fight more demons, but then I'm like, hold on, I have to check the map every 2 seconds to see if there's any hidden goodies around. Not the biggest problem in the world. Eventually, I kind of just adopt this mentality of like, whatever, I'll get what I get, and if I miss it, I miss it, and those are just some upgrades I'm not gonna have. Also, one of the weapons on the weapon wheel is your starting pistol that is only useful for the 5 seconds until you get the shotgun, and then you'd never use that thing ever again, because it's supposed to be like your emergency option when you run out of ammo on everything, but in practical terms, what it really is a slot on the weapon wheel you just never use. Speaking of the weapon wheel, I really love this thing. I'm a controller player, and I know some of my fellow PC players are gonna be like, what the heck you doing playing a shooter, playing Doom on controller? But what can I say? I find controller more comfortable, and I think the weapon wheel is a great way to handle all these weapons when playing on a controller. You just hold the weapon swap button, and it comes up, and you point with the right stick to pick which weapon you want to use, let go of weapon switch, and you swap over to that one. Gives you a quick, easy access to all your options. It's really good, and of course, as you play the game, you start to memorize where all the weapons are to the point that you don't even need to look at the weapon wheel anymore, and it lets you switch weapons really, really fast. But honestly, not fast enough. This is a super-duper minor nitpick, but when you hold the button to pull up the weapon wheel, there's a little bit of a delay on it that always screwed me up, where I feel like I want to have all the inputs memorized for the weapons, and just right bumper down pulls out the plasma rifle, but you can't do that. You gotta wait for the actual menu to appear, and that took me a while to like dial in and learn how long that delay was, and I just wish it wasn't there. I guess while we're talking about kind of nitpicky stuff that doesn't really matter, I feel like armor in this game is kinda superfluous. It's basically just another health bar that sits on top of your health bar, but you gotta get green pickups for this one. The only real thing that distinguishes armor from health is you can't get it from doing glory kills on enemies, but I don't really feel that adds a whole lot of depth or meaningful decisions or anything to the game, honestly. That, and, you know, there's a couple of balance things. Some of the weapon mods are definitely not as useful as the other ones, and you can get away with super shotgunning a lot of stuff if you really wanted to. But I don't think any of that is, like, that detrimental to the game. Just play in the cool way, and you don't have to worry about it. None of those problems are really major enough to hamper the experience. I think Doom 2016 is an incredibly fun game. Easily one of the best single-player shooters I've ever played. By the way, I guess it's worth mentioning that, for reference, everything I've talked about so far here has been focused on the game's single-player campaign, but there are 2 other major modes in Doom 2016. First, you have Snap Maps, which is basically the game's like custom level editor thing. Not something that I mess around with too much. I'm not the biggest fan of like custom level stuff, but, you know, it's cool to have it there. And then you got the competitive multiplayer, which plays like a traditional, like, old-school kind of like Quake 3D arena shooter kind of thing. Never really found it to be that much fun back in the day, and these days I'm sure it's dead online, but not really missing out on anything too special there. The single-player campaign is really the focus here. And I gotta say, it's not just the gameplay. I love just about everything about Doom 2016. I really like the visual style, the kind of like gritty, dark, almost like horror-ish atmosphere that it goes for. I think is cool. The music by the legend Mick Gordon is so friggin' awesome. And one of the things I appreciate most about Doom 2016 is that it is a video game-ass video game. It was true at the time this game came out, and maybe it's even more true nowadays. I find that way too many games, especially AAA games, try to be experiences. You know, it feels like so many games, the mission statement when they initially pitch it is like, you're gonna be a detective, and you're gonna go on this adventure where you travel into people's memories, and you try to piece together this mystery. And you're like, okay, but what's the game? And they're like, oh, it's like a third-person action RPG, whatever, it doesn't really matter that much. What matters is the player sitting there and watching our 5.5 hours of cutscenes. And that's not to completely rag on, like, cinematic story-based games. I can enjoy those from time to time if they're really good. I just find that most of the time, a lot of them aren't really that good, and I could get a better version of that experience by just watching a movie. Nowadays, if I'm going to play a game, it's because I want to play a game. And Doom 2016, thankfully, is on the same page. Like, what's the story of this game? Who cares? Shoot all the demons. And that's not just me saying that. That kind of is the story of the game, because there is something going on here, but it's really just framing for where you're going and why you're killing all these demons. And Doom Guy himself, people talked about this a lot when the game first came out, he also does not care, he just wants to kill the demons. Which ironically, I think is actually really good storytelling for a video game, because it means the player and the main character are perfectly aligned in their mentality. There is, like, lore and shit that you can read up on if you care, but the game does not force you into, like, a slow walking section where, oh, your character's injured. None of that is here. Play the game. There's, like, 3 cutscenes total in the whole thing, and they're very short. And it's just nice. I wish more games would adopt this kind of mentality of focusing on what's important and just giving you what you need, and no more than that. The focus of the story in Doom 2016 seems to be just to make you feel awesome, because as I said, this game has a little bit of a horror vibe to it with all the sci-fi corridors and death all around, but actually, you're the scariest thing running around these hallways, and that makes you feel like a super badass. It makes you feel like the Doom Guy. But of course, like the best action games, the real thing that makes you feel like a badass is the gameplay itself, because this game is goddamn hard. And for reference, this was my first time doing a Nightmare playthrough, which is like the hardest base difficulty, and it did kick my ass quite a bit and force me to get good and really learn how to play it well. And in doing that, you become the Doomslayer. You become a demon-killing machine. And that's really great, because difficulty to me is something very important for an action game, because it's not just about making the game hard, it's about making the game fun. Because as I was saying before, this is a very multifaceted game with a lot of things you need to be thinking about all the time. Puzzling out a solution to solve the current combat situation is kind of the gameplay here, and if it was too easy to find those solutions, then the game would be boring. What making things really difficult does is it makes the player play more of the game. Because if I could make a million mistakes without being killed and play very inefficiently without really suffering for it, then I have no motivation to try to engage with these mechanics to such a degree. The challenge pushes the player to understand the game more, develop their skills more, and really just play the game more. Not necessarily meaning doing more playthroughs or whatever, just on a moment-to-moment basis, you're thinking more, you're making more decisions. You could say that you're kind of playing more game per second, and more game means more fun, and that's why I love difficult games so much. And I would say Doom 2016 does a very good job of balancing its difficulty. You know, I first started up my Nightmare run here, I was like, wow, I'm dying a lot. Maybe I should turn it down to Ultra Violence. But I stuck with it, and I bashed my head against those hard combat encounters until I eventually overcame them, and on the other side of that brick wall, I was having such a great time. So this game, Doom 2016, gets almost everything right for me. I love nearly everything about it. Fantastic gameplay and great overall design, and like the core vision and direction of this game is really strong, I feel. The visuals, the sound, the power fantasy that it grants, it's just awesome in every sense of the word. And yet, as great as Doom 2016 is, I don't know if I can ever really go back to it, because prior to making this video, I had only ever played 2016, but now I have finally gotten around to playing its sequel, Doom Eternal, which is not just a dramatic step up from Doom 2016 in every single way. Doom Eternal is straight up the best shooter I've ever played, at least best single-player shooter. You know, multiplayer shooters are a very different beast, But in the realm of shooting AI, no game even comes close to Doom Eternal, which I wasn't necessarily surprised by finally playing it, because for years I've been hearing from people how much of a step up Eternal is from Doom 2016, but I was very curious as to how that even was, because to me, replaying it, Doom 2016 seemed like one of those games that's like so amazing that how do you even top that? How do you follow that up? But Doom Eternal comes in with the answer. You crank up everything that was great about 2016 to 11, and then fix almost all the problems that game had. Where do I even begin to describe what makes this game so awesome? I guess for starters, we can talk about how this game is, in many ways, very similar to Doom 2016. Obviously, it's the sequel, and that game's gameplay and overall design is the foundation here. So you have all the strengths and all of the things that were awesome about Doom 2016, this game has that, but it's the ways in which Doom Eternal expands upon the gameplay design of 2016 that makes it so phenomenal. Mobility, for example, that's probably the way in which the game has most obviously been changed. It wasn't too bad in 2016, but in comparison to Eternal, that game feels like you're playing in slow motion. Because as you can see, they've added a dash to Doom Eternal that lets you zip around the battlefield way faster. You get 2 charges of it, and it refills pretty quickly, so this is something you're doing constantly while playing this game. And of course, that gives you much more air maneuverability, as you can dash in one direction, then dash in the other. You can throw a double jump somewhere in the mix there, and they've also added these monkey bars to the arenas that you can use to stay up in the air even more. In many ways, Doom Eternal kind of plays a little bit like the floor is lava, because to compensate for this increased mobility and speed, the enemies have been made even more aggressive than they were in the previous game, so you're going to need to be even more on the move to avoid all of it, and generally being in the air is a really good way to do that. Thankfully, you have another new mobility tool that makes this extremely fun, the Super Shotgun's new weapon mod. It was the only weapon in the last game that didn't have one, but now it has the best in the entire game, because this thing now has a gosh darn grappling hook, and it's even more fun than it sounds like it would be. Obviously, the meat hook has so many applications. You can use it as a gap closer, you can use it to get yourself out of trouble, you can use it to get some height, you can use it to refresh your double jump and just keep you in the air longer, you can use it to chase down glory kills. When you have it upgraded, you can use it to light dudes on fire. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But probably the coolest function of it that honestly I don't take nearly enough advantage of is you can fling yourself around with it, launching yourself with tons of speed, allowing you to clear the entire arena in a matter of seconds. Players who really know how to utilize the meat hook can do some real nutty things with it, but even at my level, it's so much fun to use. And if you know anything about me, you know that I'm a really big fan of like 3D action platformers with a lot of cool movement mechanics, and Doom Eternal now basically is that. In fact, when you're navigating the stages, they've added like whole platforming sections that take advantage of all this cool new movement stuff, which to my knowledge some people find annoying, but I think it's awesome and really makes sense. You know, the game's just using what it has to make some interesting gameplay. If you're going to be navigating the space, you should use these movement tools, and I think it's really fun. And what it does for the combat, obviously, is makes movement much more interesting and fun, but it also ups the pace of the game a lot, which is to go along with the fact that in all aspects, Doom Eternal is a much faster game than Doom 2016 was. The rate of decisions per second is much, much higher here, and those decisions are more difficult to make, as this game is a lot more complex than the last one was, resulting in the game being substantially more difficult than the last one. I did my first playthrough here on Nightmare, because I figured I just did 2016 on Nightmare, let's just keep going. And I'm glad I did that, because this game is insane, and I was having the time of my life playing it. What makes me love Doom Eternal so much is that it squeezes every single drop of potential fun its gameplay systems could provide. Similar to the last game, the core of the gameplay in Doom Eternal is about decision-making. It's about, at any given moment, looking at the battlefield around you and deciding, what should I do? But the difference is that in this game, every single aspect of the game has been so finely tuned to make those decisions as interesting as possible. For example, ammunition. It is much more scarce than it was in Doom 2016, meaning you no longer have the option of just relying on a small handful of weapons you prefer. You have to use your entire arsenal because you just don't have the ammunition to play otherwise. The guns themselves have been made more interesting as well. For the most part, we got the same weapons as the last game, or new ones that function similarly, but many things have been adjusted about them. Many changes, some of them have new weapon mods, and I think in general, all the weapon mods are much more balanced. I don't find that there's one that's clearly and obviously better than the other. I switch between weapon mods much more frequently in this game than I did the last one. They also got rid of the useless pistol and instead put the BFG in its slot on the weapon wheel, so that button is now free and used for something else. Also, speaking of the weapon wheel, they addressed my problem in 2016 of not being able to pull it up fast enough. There's an option now to reduce the delay to the point where it's near instantaneous, and it feels so much better. I can switch weapons now near instantly. You can see in my gameplay, the weapon wheel is up for only a matter of frames now. It's so good. Also worth noting, I really like how they have color-coded the guns on the weapon wheel based on how much ammo they have. Weapons that are full are green, and weapons that are empty are red, so with just a quick glance, you have all the information you need about where your ammunition is at. Really smart UI design there. But anyway, the main thing that has made the weapons so much better here is that now everything has its own role to play. In the last game, you could use pretty much any weapon in any situation, and you can kinda do that here, but now there are definitely specializations within the weapons that make some much more suited to certain situations than others. Some of this comes from the inherent usefulness of the weapon, how it works, but some of it comes from the new enemy weakness system. This is one of my favorite new features of Doom Eternal. Many enemy types now have weaknesses, either a weak point or a type of weapon they're weak to, and exploiting that weakness can either kill the enemy much more quickly or make them weaker in some way so they're easier to deal with. For example, the Arachnotrons, the spider brain dudes, you can shoot the turret on top of them with certain weapon types and destroy it so they can no longer fire it. Or the Mancubus, you can shoot off its arm cannons with certain weapon types so it can't use those anymore. Hell Knights are weak to the chain gun and can get staggered by its shots. Cacodemons can be instantly put in the glory kill state by shooting a grenade into their mouths. These enemy weaknesses do two major things for the gameplay. One, it puts more emphasis on aim, because that wasn't actually that important in Doom 2016, because so many of the enemies were so big, you could just shoot at them. Now you have something to aim for precisely, bringing a little more skill into it and just making it more fun to shoot things, especially while you're moving so fast and flying all over the place. Damn, is it satisfying to land those shots in the middle of all that. But what the weaknesses also do is they give each tool their own time to shine, because like I talked about in the last game, you could use basically anything, but I like to try to see what is the best option, you know, what can deal with these enemies slightly more efficiently than something else. Doom Eternal has taken that and made that much more important in the game, where it's not about what weapon can do it slightly better, it's about what options will deal with your current situation much better, which makes those decisions a lot more meaningful and way more satisfying. If you're not dealing with things in a good way, then a lot of these enemies can be a real nightmare and take a while to kill. But conversely, if you approach things in the right way, then even the strongest enemies in the game can be killed in a matter of seconds. And doing that makes you feel so awesome, because it's not just a matter of your skill allowing you to wreck the enemies, it's also a matter of your strategy. On top of that, you have a lot of new tools in this game that serve their own little niche, that have their own function. Similar to the chainsaw, that's your tool for refilling your ammo, you have more things like that, like the Flame Belch, which is a quick little burst of flamethrower that will light enemies on fire, and enemies that are on fire drop armor both over time and when they're killed. This fixes the problem from the last game of armor kind of just being whatever, because now you have two different health resources that are refilled in different ways. Health is refilled by killing enemies and landing glory kills, but armor is gained by burning things. So now you look at your health situation and see, what do I need? Do I need health? Do I need armor? And that influences what you choose to do in the fight to get those resources. And also, you want to just use the flamethrower as much as possible because it just does damage, and that's good, and you want as much armor as you can. But as always, there's more to it than that, because you could just burn one guy and get armor for him, but much better is looking for situations where you can burn lots of guys and get a ton of armor, but you don't want to be so picky that you end up wasting opportunities to use it at all and not using the cooldown. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Every little thing has a tough decision you need to make associated with using it. You also have your grenades, which work quite differently than the last game because now you have this shoulder-mounted grenade launcher, meaning your hands are free. You can actually throw out grenades while doing anything else. Plus also you got the ice bomb, which will stun enemies and make them take more damage, and obviously that can be incredibly useful for the big tough enemies to get some free hits in. And an important note about all these tools so far, the chainsaw, flame belch, and your grenades, is that they all work on cooldowns. They come back up automatically over time, which means if you really want to maximize your usage of them and get as much bang for your buck as possible, then you really need to pay attention to those cooldowns and be using them all the time. Which, by the way, I really love the HUD elements near the center of the screen that tell you what's available on cooldowns. So useful not having to look at the corners to see what I have. That was added in a patch at some point during the game's life, but as someone that came to the game late, I can't imagine playing without that. It's so useful. You also have the Crucible, a sword that can kill almost anything in one hit, but the ammo for it is incredibly rare, so similar to the BFG, it's about picking what is the best opportunity to use this thing. The BFG itself now has a second option, the Unmaker, a weapon more suited to dealing massive damage to a single target, so you gotta pick which one of these things you want to use because they share ammo. And you also have the Blood Punch, an enhanced melee attack that does an obscene amount of damage, and this one does not work on a cooldown. It's actually filled by doing glory kills, which is great because it gives glory kills another function. Previously, all it did was give you more healing items, which is really good, but something you don't need if you're playing well and not taking damage. Then there's no motivation for me to do glory kills. Now there is. Even if a player is playing perfectly, glory kills are now something useful because it will allow them to put out even more damage than they were before. There's all kinds of smart design like this all over Doom Eternal, and as you can see, you have a lot of tools in this game that can be used in a lot of different ways. And maybe you can see what I was saying, that this kind of design ends up pushing the decision-making space of this game into a much more fun and interesting direction. Now, what I would argue is the most fun way to play is the way to play, which I think is a much better design. In the last game, you had all these tools, but you didn't have to use them. You could, but if all you wanted to do was win the fights, then all these weapons and weapon mods and all these options were really unnecessary. But now, no part of this game's design is unnecessary. You need to rely on every single option if you want to succeed. Which I was not surprised to learn that some people take issue with. Some people feel that this game's design is very restrictive because you have to use everything, whereas the last game offered freedom in terms of what weapons you liked using and which ones you didn't. You could play in your own style, which is true, but I don't really see that as restrictive. I just see that as the game forcing you to play it properly. Doom 2016 clearly wanted that as well, it's just that the system didn't have any way of forcing players to do that. There were holes in it, and those holes may have allowed players to play in their own style, but it also allowed players to play in a way that is significantly less fun than if you're using everything and going nuts. Now they've patched up the holes and said you can't get away with that anymore, you gotta play the game for real. It is taking away a bit of the player's freedom in that sense, but it's for their own good. You know, they want you to play the real game of Doom Eternal, the game behind the game. Something that I think a lot of players in general with games don't think about enough. What is the actual game here? You know, you think about rock, paper, scissors. What's the game there? Oh, well, you got three options, each one winning and losing to another, and both players pick an option at the same time, and you want to pick the winning option. That's the game, right? Wrong. Those are the rules of rock, paper, scissors, but the game is in trying to predict what your opponent is gonna do and counterplaying them. You think about the opponent and how they play. When you played rock, paper, scissors with them in the past, what do they usually go with? Is there a pattern to how they change up their choices? If they say, I'm gonna play rock, are they actually gonna stick with that, or is that a mind game? thinking about all this stuff and trying to predict what your opponent is going to do. That's the game of rock, paper, scissors. The rules are just a way to facilitate the game. Doom Eternal might be a shooter, but the game is not running around and killing demons. The game is decision-making. If you could just get away with using one weapon and just shooting everything mindlessly, then you're no longer playing the decision-making game here. You're playing a different game. I've heard complaints from some people that this game is overly complicated because you got all these things you need to think about, you got all these cooldowns that you need to be juggling, and you can't just shoot guys like you could in any other shooter. But personally, I don't think that this game is overly complicated at all. It is a very complex game, but it's all very purposeful. Every system is there for a good reason because it all adds some extra layers to the decision-making space. The fact that you have all these resources that you need to manage means that the situation you find yourself in is always changing. At any given moment while playing Doom Eternal, you have so many things you need to think about. You gotta look at the enemies and their composition around the battlefield, consider the enemy types and what strategies you're gonna use to deal with them. Gotta think about how you're gonna move around the arena and how you're gonna spend your mobility resources, you know, your dashes and double jumps. You gotta look at your offensive resources and see what you have, what weapons do you have ammo for, what's available right now on cooldown. You gotta look at your health resources, what do you need? Do you need health? Do you need armor? You gotta consider all of that and then decide out of your dozens of options of what you can do, what are you going to do? And you need to make decisions like that many times every single second, and the resource situation you find yourself in is constantly shifting as you spend ammo for one weapon type and then burn guys and get armor, and then things come off cooldown, and then you spend other things and they're on cooldown, you chainsaw a guy and got your ammo refilled. Now you find yourself in a totally different situation that requires you to reevaluate everything and think about what you're gonna do now. This is what makes the combat so rich in this game. There is an unimaginably immense amount of situations you can find yourself in, and as I said when talking about Doom 2016, puzzling your way out of these situations is the fun. In Doom Eternal, that puzzling is so much more intricate, there's so much more variety to it, and although there are situations in which some of your options are definitely better than others, it is still a very, very open-ended combat system that leaves so much room for player creativity in how you want to deal with all these enemies. One criticism that I've heard about this game is that it's actually not that complicated. It's very simple and almost like Simon Says. Because of the weaknesses some enemies have, this game can apparently seem like just match the thing to the guy. Pinkies will be instantly killed by a blood punch, so anytime you see a pinky, blood punch it. Boom, no thought required at all. But to that, I would say this is what I was talking about before, about playing on lower difficulties, allowing you to make more mistakes and play less efficiently. Yes, there are weaknesses, and you can utilize them to kill enemies more quickly and easily, but not always. It's not always that simple and straightforward. Just because the enemies have weaknesses doesn't mean you have to exploit them. There are tons of ways to kill just about everything in this game. Take the Arachnotron, for example, where you can shoot its turret off. You don't have to do that, and many times I find myself in the heat of combat, I don't have time to bother with that, so I'm just like, whatever, I'm just gonna shoot them until they die, and that works, and it's perfectly valid. I'd really like to highlight the Plasma Shield guys, because they're an enemy type that can seemingly be one of the most obvious ones to deal with. They got their Plasma Shield, so you shoot it with the Plasma Rifle until it explodes, and that's how you deal with them. Sure, but you don't have to do that, and that's not even the fastest or most efficient way to deal with them in many situations. You could also blood punch them, or you could chainsaw them, or you could meat hook them, or you can freeze them with an ice bomb, or you can use the remote detonate on the rocket launcher to get around their shield. You can throw a grenade behind them, you can shoot a sticky bomb behind them and then stagger them. There are many solutions to any problem you might need to solve in Doom Eternal. It's just that this game does not want you to be able to solve these problems mindlessly, where you can just do whatever and use whatever and not think about it very much, and that'll work. The game just wants to make sure that you're thinking about what you're doing. But within that, you are very free to do whatever you want, and I feel that this combat system is actually one of the most open-ended ones I've ever seen in any shooter. You can absolutely have your preferences in this game. You know, how do you like to deal with this enemy type versus that enemy type? How do you deal with these kinds of situations? Even what kind of combos do you make for yourself out of your weapons? You know, quick switching from one to the other. You might develop some habits of, I always go from super shotgun to ballista to rocket launcher to minigun or whatever you end up doing. Very comparable to like a character action game like Devil May Cry or something. And that is not a comparison that I make lightly. Devil May Cry is truly the peak of action games, but I do genuinely believe that Doom Eternal is up there. I think this is easily one of the most fun and well-designed combat systems in any game I've ever played. And you know, some people aren't really into it, some people don't like it. That's fine. I just feel like some of the criticism out there is a bit off the mark. But anyway, yeah, as you can tell from all my gushing, I adore the combat design of Doom Eternal. I think the systems here are brilliant. But those systems wouldn't mean anything if the fighting itself wasn't also very good. Fortunately, this game matches the quality of its combat design with the quality of its enemy design. These are some of the best enemies I've seen in any action game I've ever played. This is one of those games that has that sequel benefit where it builds on top of the previous one, so it got all the enemies from the last game and then a whole bunch of new ones thrown on top of that. So at a base level, you got a lot of enemy types in this game, but what really impressed me about the enemies here is how every single one, similar to your tools, they all have a unique role to play within the combat encounter design. Because many action games, even some of the best, will have a lot of enemies that overlap with each other in how they work and how you fight them. That's not really a thing here. Every enemy type here is very distinct. They have different ways they fight. They have different strategies for the player to employ against them. You got melee enemies that will rush you. You got weaker enemies that stay on the sidelines of the fight and try to pester you. You got long-range enemies, flying enemies, enemies that aren't that mobile, but if you get near them, they become a big problem. Enemies that buff other ones or protect other ones. You got enemies that apply debuffs to the player. You got lots of different enemies in this game that all do different things. And remember that all need to be fought in different ways based on what their weaknesses are. And a big part of the decisions you need to make in these fights is what enemies are you going to prioritize? What are the ones that are causing the biggest problems? What are the ones that you really want to get rid of first to make your life a lot easier? Plus, of course, you have the major enemies, the really big ones that have a dramatic impact on the flow and the feel of the fight. Ones that when they show up, your strategy completely changes, the way you're moving completely changes because they're just that powerful and demanding. Of course, the infamous Marauder being number one on that list. A lot of people find this enemy annoying, and personally I did too when I first started playing the game, but as I figured out how to deal with them, I think that they're a very interesting piece of the overall combat puzzle, just like all the enemies in this game, just fantastic all around. With all the enemy types serving a different role in the fight, the way you combine them together can create interesting scenarios in which the player is presented with combat situations that they need to solve in different ways. And I was so thoroughly impressed by how consistently this game was able to keep throwing new, interesting enemy encounters at me that forced me to think about things in entirely new ways. My entire way through the game and lots of its post-game stuff, I never once felt that any fight in this game was just a copy and paste of another fight. Which is very impressive because Doom Eternal is a much longer game than 2016 was, and yet, both of these games have zero filler in them whatsoever. They don't waste the player's time, they don't put all this stupid shit in there, there's no mini-games, there's no turret sequences, there's nothing like that. You do two things in these Doom games. You kill things, and you explore the level. Nothing but core gameplay, the thing you're here for, the thing that's fun. It's fantastic, especially when you look at so many other AAA games and they throw in so much stupid crap in there. These games, especially Doom Eternal, avoids a lot of the pitfalls of so many of its contemporaries. This game really stands out to me as such a shining example of what a AAA game can be when they're not wasting development resources and their giant budget on trying to make the most realistic graphics in the entire world. Oh my god, every pore on the character's face is individually textured. Who cares? These games focus on what matters, and they just make an incredible experience out of that. One that I don't even really understand how it exists, because, you know, this is a AAA game. That means a massive budget that in turn means they want millions and millions of sales to make as much money as they can. So, unsurprisingly, most AAA games try to appeal to the widest audience possible, which is why most of them tend to skew fairly easy. But then you have this game standing in complete defiance of that. Here we have one of the hardest, fastest, most complex, nuanced, hardcore action games I've ever played, and I just find it kind of weird that Bethesda would approve something like this. Like, if I was an investor or executive or whatever, I'd be looking at this game and go, what on earth are you doing? No one is going to be able to play this. This game is absolutely relentless. It's so fast, it's got all these things you need to be thinking about, and these fights are brutal. So many enemies active all at once, and the big arena fights can just go on and on and on with so many waves of enemies that you gotta fight through. It is a real endurance challenge that is at an incredibly high level of intensity the entire time. And to be honest, I gotta admit that even someone like me that loves that shit, some of the missions and fights in this game actually got to a level where I was completely exhausted after I got through it. This is just not the kind of thing that most people who play video games are looking for. Like, ultra-hardcore action games like this are pretty niche. The audience that's into them isn't that big. There's a reason that most games by Platinum end up flopping. I guess one difference is that this is a shooter, and those generally tend to have a larger hardcore audience from, you know, back in the day and just competitive shooters in general. A lot more high-skilled players out there compared to stuff like character action games or fighting games, I guess. Or maybe it's just a brand name of Doom. What that name signifies and represents allows them to get away with this kind of thing. I don't know what it is, but I'm very grateful for it because these games are the best. Though, because of how crazy intense this game is, I probably wouldn't recommend Doom Eternal to a lot of people out there if you don't have experience with other hardcore action games. Because this game demands a level of mastery that very, very few other games ever ask of the player, and I feel a lot of players are not going to be used to this kind of thing and not comfortable with what it's asking of them. You know, this is the kind of game that doesn't really have loopholes to it. There's no way to circumvent the design and make things a lot easier for yourself. You can't grind to make yourself more powerful. There's not certain aspects of the design that you can just not bother to think about if you don't want to. You know, the kinds of things that a lot of other games will let you get away with, that's not going to happen here. Although, I don't know, I've only played on Nightmare, maybe on the lower difficulties. This game is more approachable to general audiences. But to my understanding, all the lower difficulties do is reduce the rate of decisions you need to make and allow you to make more mistakes and poor decisions. But you still need to fully understand everything about this game and think about it all during the fights. Though, now that I think about it, one thing that might make that more approachable compared to a lot of other hardcore action games is that this game is actually really well tutorialized. Most games like this do a terrible job of teaching players how to play, and you mostly gotta figure out everything on your own. And after playing so many of those kinds of games, I'm used to that kind of thing, but I've seen so many people play a game like this for the first time, and they never figure out any of the nuances or the more advanced mechanics or whatever. But Doom Eternal does not make that mistake. This game makes sure you know exactly how to play it, by approaching its tutorialization in a very non-conventional way compared to what is usually considered good tutorialization in a video game. Nowadays, a lot of praise is heaped on naturally teaching how to play the game just through the design, where you throw like very easy, simple obstacles at the player where they don't even realize they're being taught how to play the game. This game doesn't do that. In fact, it kind of does the polar opposite. It just right in your face tells you exactly how things work. which might sound annoying, but thankfully they do it in the right way. They don't try to teach you anything that you can't easily figure out on your own. What they teach you is the important information that might not necessarily be super obvious, and they convey everything in a super efficient manner. Like, anytime you encounter a new enemy type in this game, there's just a little pop-up that says, hey, here's this enemy type, here's how it works, here's its weaknesses, and they play a little video demonstrating everything to you, so that way, when you go into your very first fight against this brand new enemy type, you already know everything you need to, and you know exactly what to do. Now, some players might feel this takes away their ability to learn how to play the game, but by doing this, the game can be designed in such a way where it assumes you know how to play it, so it doesn't have to softball you with a bunch of, like, easy tutorial gameplay. It's all 100% real deal big boy gameplay the whole time, and the method the game uses to ensure you've learned the lessons that it's tried to teach you is it kills you if you don't, over and over and over again. Which I really enjoyed. I felt that this game was very aggressively pushing me to get better throughout my entire time with it, to the point where I feel like I didn't really, truly understand how to play this game well until I was deep into the post-game content. Which actually, let's start talking about that, because it's really good in Doom Eternal. One thing I want to highlight is the collectibles in this game, because they've been totally fixed from Doom 2016. You know what I talked about? It takes too much time looking for them, and they get in the way of the pacing, and if you end up missing stuff, you gotta reload the mission and play through it again and look for everything again. All of those problems are gone in Doom Eternal thanks to the addition of fast travel. When you get to the end of the mission, but before you complete it, you get the option to teleport to anywhere throughout the level, meaning you can very easily clean up everything before you finish, so you don't have to come back later, and it means you don't have to, like, check every single nook and cranny on your initial playthrough. You can just keep your eyes peeled and get what you see along the way, and then just go back for cleanup before you finish, so you can just play through the level without having to worry about it. It is so great. Like, that's the kind of polish that I really appreciate about Doom Eternal. They really tried to fix every little thing that could go wrong here. In fact, they managed to smooth over what was going to be another criticism I had for this game with the master levels. These are remixed versions of a few missions of the game where they change around the enemy placements to make these levels so absurdly difficult, I'm actually surprised I was able to beat some of them. Some of these master levels, no joke, a single level could take me like over 4 hours to complete because I was dying so much. In fact, the one for the DLC, World Spear, I was about to give up on it. I did not think I could do it. I was so exhausted from the entire level up to that. The final fight was so brutal, but I did stick with it and I managed to beat it, and it was so incredibly satisfying. And the criticism that these master levels smoothed over for me is I was gonna say that some of the tools in this game felt a little bit overpowered, but when you get to the master levels, you stop thinking that real fast. What might normally seem like a slightly overtuned tool that makes the game a bit too easy becomes your lifeline when you're playing these levels, especially the hammer introduced in the DLC. This is a really powerful tool that stuns guys and gives you a bunch of resources. Definitely felt it was way too strong when I was playing through the DLC, especially with ammo management. I basically didn't have to worry about that at all once I got this. But when you're playing this master level, you're like, oh god, I need the hammer desperately, please! So never mind. Nothing is overpowered in this game. Actually a really great balancing method. If you have overpowered tools in your game, just make challenges that are so hard that they demand mastery of the overpowered mechanic. Honestly, it's kind of awesome. Though I do still have one somewhat large criticism for this game. Extra lives. This is a system that I really don't like. Throughout the levels while you're exploring, you can find some extra lives, which when you die, they will automatically heal you to full and let you keep on going. Which, personally, I'm not really a fan of. I feel like it allows you to get away with sloppy play in a way that the previous game, for example, didn't let me do. Playing on Nightmare, if I made 2 or 3 major mistakes, that was it. I'm dead. But because not every fight is this giant arena where you're probably gonna die, you can end up accumulating a number of lives in Doom Eternal to the point where I had like 6 lives that I was carrying around. And when you have that many get out of jail free cards, it feels like the game is taking away my accountability as a player. I can now make tons of mistakes and still win the fight. And I felt like it was denying me the rewarding feeling of overcoming a big tough fight that I was dying on a lot because I would just get it for what felt like free. So, not too long into my playthrough of Doom Eternal, I started doing something that I normally don't like to do when I'm playing games. I gave myself my own personal rule of not using extra lives, and when I did that, I found the game much more fun, as I was actually being punished for making critical mistakes. Not the biggest problem in the world or anything, I was able to just circumvent it, but it feels very incongruous with the rest of the design of Doom Eternal. Extra lives are something that are only for players that are struggling. They have no function for players that are doing well, and it feels so counter to the mentality of every other aspect of this game. Probably a good tool for helping out other players, but I wish at the very least extra lives had some sort of other application for players who didn't want or didn't need them. Like, I wish I could spend an extra life to temporarily give myself quad damage or something like that. You know, add a trade-off, add a decision there. Give me a reason to not rely on this thing that takes away my accountability. Kind of like what Horde mode does. Let's start getting into the alternative modes of Doom Eternal now. Though while this is called Horde, it's not really like Horde mode you see in other shooters. It's more of an arcade score attack kind of thing, where you do a bunch of different waves, and it takes you across different arenas, and it's got like bonus rounds and everything, and score multipliers, and it's really about trying to get the highest score that you can, less so just like waves of enemies that you have to kill. And honestly, I'm not really too into this mode. I feel like it's a little overly gimmicky for my taste, but you know, it's cool, it's fun in its own way. And it does actually have a motivation for players not to use lives, because you can rack up a ton of extra lives in this mode, but you get a score bonus at the end for every life you didn't need to use. Same for BFG shots as well, which is interesting. And I like that kind of idea, you know, not necessarily with score, but some kind of motivation to not use lives in the main game would be nice. Because I'm not much of a score chaser in games. I played this mode once, and I was like, okay, yeah, I don't really need to play that again. And then you also have Battle Mode, the competitive play for Doom Eternal, which is very different than 2016. Rather than go in the traditional deathmatch route, they went for asymmetric multiplayer, where one player's the Doomslayer and 2 other players are demons trying to kill him. Very, very interesting, unique, very cool. But to be honest, it's not really something that I see myself putting a lot of time into. It's a fun novelty, it's kind of cool. I think it would be a lot of fun if you were playing this with friends, but overall, I'm like, it's a neat little thing, but not really something I care too much for. By the way, I want to get a little off topic here to talk about something that's not directly part of Doom Eternal, but is, in my opinion, very important to playing it, which is that if you are a controller player like me, then I must say, this game feels like using claw grip is absolutely mandatory. Now, if you're someone that's not familiar with claw grip and is asking what the heck you're talking about, Pariah, it's easier to show you than describe it. Basically, it's a way to hold your controller that enables you to use the right stick and the face buttons at the same time. You have your thumb on the right stick, and you press the face buttons with your pointer finger, and you hit the shoulder buttons with your middle finger. This lets you do more actions simultaneously, which is very important for a game like Doom Eternal as a shooter, as it enables you to jump and dash while still being able to move the camera. Now, anytime I talk about claw grip, I always get responses from people saying like, oh my god, how do you play like that? You're gonna get arthritis. But personally, I've been playing video games with claw grip for like 20 years, and it's never been a problem for me. It's never gotten uncomfortable. It's never hurt. I can play games for many, many, many hours at a time without it being a problem at all. I don't know, maybe it's a bit easier for me because I got big hands, but I would highly recommend giving it a try. I pretty much use it 100% of the time whenever I'm playing a 3D game with camera control. You know, shooters, action games, 3D platformers. It is just an objectively better way to hold the controller. Even if you like to do like bumper jumper or something, it still doesn't get around the fact that you have actions on the face buttons that you can't use, and Claw Grip just fixes that. So if you've not tried it before, I would recommend give it a try, see if you can get used to it, because it will really up your game. Another tangent I'd like to go on. This one might be me going over the deep end, but I don't care. I want to talk about games as art. Oh my god, what are you doing, Brian? I know, no one wants to hear the talks about, oh, whether or not games are art, just to argue against people who don't respect the medium. I'm not here to talk about that. What I am here to talk about is that whenever games are put up on this pedestal of like, oh, the artistic achievement of what video games can be, it's always these artsy-fartsy cinematic games where it's really trying to tell a story and it has a message behind it. It's gonna make you cry, or it's some indie game with very little gameplay to it. It's about depression or whatever. And just so you know, I'm just poking fun here. I enjoy those kinds of games. I love Journey. I thought that was an incredible experience. But what I'm getting at is, why is that always where we go when we talk about games as art? And obviously, I know the reason why. But the thing that bothers me about it is whenever people are talking about high art in games, they're always talking about the artistic achievement of games in reference to another artistic medium. It's always how good the story is, how good the acting is, how good the art is, the music, and all that stuff is absolutely important and definitely should be appreciated. But I see so little appreciation out there for the art of game design in games, which has always been weird to me. You know, you don't judge a painting by how good its music theory is. Of course, games do have these elements of story and visuals and all that, but what about the game? And I bring this up because, in my opinion, Doom Eternal should be considered an example of high art in game design. I think this is a beautifully designed game that you could put in a museum. Why not? Of course, it will never be considered high art because it's a goofy game about killing demons, and it's got blood and guts and gore and guns. And as we all know, that kind of pursuit of artistic greatness is a whole crock of shit anyway, so it's not like this matters. I just think that if we want to talk about what truly makes games an incredible art form, we should be putting games like Doom Eternal right next to something like Omori. Anyway, that's finally about it for gameplay stuff in Doom Eternal, but as for other things, I definitely want to talk about the visuals in this game, because it's fairly different than Doom 2016. You know, that game's going for a kind of dark, gritty style that I felt worked really well, whereas Doom Eternal is a lot more goofy and colorful, which makes it actually a lot closer to, like, original Doom stuff. But when I first started playing this game, I wasn't really feeling it. Coming off of Doom 2016, where it felt like I was killing fucking demons, playing this game, it felt like I was killing clowns now, with how bright and exaggerated everything is. But over time, I really warmed up to it, and I think the art style really fits the game, because with the inherent nature of how this game plays, it is very over-the-top and cartoony, and I think a visual style that matches that works a lot better than if they just tried to do the same thing again as Doom 2016. And it goes along well with the much more fantastical environments you go to in this game. You get a lot more variety. And also, there's a lot more visual clarity in this game compared to the last one. You know, sometimes with the dark, moody lighting, the demons could be a little hard to see, but that's never a problem in Doom Eternal. Everything is always very clear, very visible, and I think it all works really, really well. Last thing I want to talk about is story stuff. I still don't give a flying shit about what's happening in these Doom games. But while, like the last game, Eternal is not getting in your way with the story stuff, it is putting it a lot more in your face than the last game did. There's a lot more emphasis placed on the Doomslayer and the lore and the history with the Makers and the Sentinels, and I just don't give a shit about any of this. And it's very clear the game wants me to give a shit. And I'm sorry, it is just not gonna happen. I'm here to shoot things, and I'm really not interested in whatever stories you're trying to tell. And I wanted this to be the final thing I talked about with Eternal, because it will make an excellent transition into Doom the Dark Ages, where this game really wants you to care about the story stuff, and I still don't. Not that this has become a super story-heavy game or anything, it's still incredibly simple and is mostly just there to make you feel awesome and have you go to cool places and kill cool things. But now there's a bunch of cutscenes in this game where you watch a bunch of people flap their lips. And I really do not care, and I found myself on my first playthrough sitting there going, when do I get to shoot demons, please? Obviously not a major problem, you can just skip the cutscenes if you want to, which I would recommend. But this is very representative of the many ways in which Doom of the Dark Ages feels like it's betraying so many of the things that were great about the previous games. Many of the things about them that I'd specifically praised because they're not falling into the same pitfalls that lots of other big games do. This game does that now. Like, there is this one part in Doom Eternal where you get on this big turret to shoot something blocking your way, and I remember distinctly thinking to myself when I played this the first time, if this was any other game, then I would have to manually aim and fire this cannon on my own for no reason, and then we'd have this whole dedicated turret gameplay that no one wants to do. But Doom Eternal is a smart game that understands that that is a waste of time. It is a focused game that hones in on its fantastic core combat. We don't need some dumb turret sections. And then Doom the Dark Ages does exactly that, where you get on a turret to blow up a thing for no reason, and you have turret gameplay. And again, it's not a big deal. These sections are very short, they don't really get in the way very much. But why is this here? This feels like the kind of shallow, superficial spectacle that you see in other AAA games where, oh, you gotta climb up the mountainside, and oh, the wind is pelting at your character, and a rock falls out from under them, and oh no, they're gonna fall. But they get their grip back, and now you start going again. But in reality, you're just holding up on the left stick and not doing anything. Not that this game has anything nearly that bad, but it's got stuff that feels cut from the same cloth. Like one of the things I praised about the first two games, they didn't have anything but core gameplay. Now that's no longer the case. We got two alternative gameplay styles, two mini-games. You got the mech gameplay, which isn't too bad, it's decently fun, doesn't overstay its welcome, and the power fantasy here definitely is very effective. But then you have the dragon gameplay, which is pretty terrible in my opinion, and goes on for way too long, and you do it way too many times. And it just feels so weird to me. The last two Doom games didn't have stuff like this. I don't recall any Doom fans clamoring for really shallow mini-games. It feels like stuff that's been added for non-Doom fans, for non-Doom players, for players that play other kinds of games that are used to this kind of dumb shit. And in fact, a number of things about Doom the Dark Ages feels like it's meant to try to appeal to people that didn't like Doom Eternal specifically. A lot of the changes made to Doom the Dark Ages seem like attempts to address a lot of the criticisms that Eternal got. Which, of course, makes sense, trying to address some of the problems of your previous game in your next game. That's what Eternal was from Doom 2016. But as someone who friggin' adores every aspect of Doom Eternal's gameplay, that's not exactly something that I want to see. Because this game is not the sequel to Doom Eternal. It is the next Doom game, but it's very much its own thing. Really, if anything, the gameplay design here feels more like a follow-up to Doom 2016. Really weird, but I'll get into that later. For now, what I want to make clear is you might be getting the impression that I don't like Doom the Dark Ages because of how I've talked about it so far, but that is not the case. I think this game is great, I think it kicks ass, I think it's super fun, I've done 2 playthroughs of it, and I've had a great time with it. However, I do not think it is as good as Doom Eternal. Fair, that game would be incredibly difficult to top. But I do think this game has a number of problems that have nothing to do with it not being like Doom Eternal. I have no issues with this game being different. I have issues with this game being not as good. So let's get into it. First thing you need to know is that this game, unlike Eternal, does not build directly off the previous games. This one is a reset, so forget a lot of the things you knew. One of the biggest differences between Dark Ages and the previous games is that movement has been dramatically de-emphasized here. You got no more dashing, no more double jumps, and really no more verticality at all. Most of the fights are fought on flat planes now. And the reason for taking away a lot of these mobility tools is that this game wants to kind of bring things back a little closer to the original Doom games, where you focus on that horizontal movement, dodging the way out of shots just by weaving left and right. And that, I do think, is very fun. You have to be a lot more mindful of the enemy attacks in this game, especially compared to Eternal. For as much as I love that game, one thing I will say that I'd even argue 2016 did a little bit better than it is dodging enemy attacks in a sense, because in that game, the mobility was so crazy that as long as you stayed moving and kind of kept yourself pretty erratic, that alone would dodge a lot of stuff for you, and you wouldn't have to think about it that much, just have to keep your eyes peeled for certain enemy attacks that were gonna hit you. Whereas in Doom 2016, I felt like I had to be much more deliberate with my movement, really pay attention to those enemy shots, and weave around them very specifically. Doom the Dark Ages puts a much greater emphasis on that, because now you have to pay attention to nearly every attack coming your way, and for the most part, your only option is just using your basic movement to get around it. Though, there's still some room for some cool stuff, as you do have a sprint in this game now, which I do find interesting, because it means you can move much faster, but only when you're going forward, which means sometimes when I saw projectiles coming at me that I didn't think I could get out of the way fast enough for, I would turn away from it so I could sprint to the side so I could get out of the way more quickly, and I thought that was cool. I was thinking about my movement in a different way compared to the previous games. And when you're sprinting, you get a much higher jump that you can use to go over some things in certain situations, such as when your shield breaks. Speaking of the shield, this also has a mobility option attached to it, the shield bash. You can lock onto enemies and launch yourself at them really fast, almost acting as this game's equivalent to the meat hook as a way to close the gap on enemies while also doing damage. But a cool thing I realized about the shield bash is you're also invincible to projectiles while doing it, so if you see a pattern you might not be able to weave around, you have the option of just plowing right through it, which is pretty cool. This is an example of the differences here in Dark Ages really shining compared to the previous games, because it is very different, but it still has depth all its own that gives it a very unique feel, yet is still really fun. But then differences that are not as strong to me are the changes to your offensive tools in Doom the Dark Ages. This is especially where I feel a lot was done in response to the criticism of Doom Eternal, because like I said, some people felt that game was overly complicated. Well, this game is quite simplified in comparison. Weapons especially did not have the same kind of sauce they did before. Not to say that these weapons aren't cool and fun to use, they absolutely are, but the design of the weapons themselves and the weapon system overall is just not as interesting. Like, for example, you technically have more weapons in this game than the previous ones. You got 6 slots on the weapon wheel and 2 weapons in each slot, except for 1, making for 11 total weapons as opposed to the previous game's 7, not counting the pistol and BFG. More weapons sounds cool, right? But this game also does not have weapon mods like the previous games did, so while those, each weapon was basically 3 in 1, each weapon here only does one thing, so in reality, you actually have less offensive tools than you did before. And you also don't have grenades, ice bomb, flamethrower, chainsaw, blood punch, crucible, or hammer. All of those things are gone, and to be fair, many of them have been replaced with new things, but still, at the end of the day, you do have less to work with here than you did previously, which is a little bit disappointing to me. You now no longer have all these different tools with all these different functions, you gotta pick the right one for the right job. Now things have been consolidated to just your gun, your shield, and your melee. And I say gun singular very purposefully. It's come down to your gun, not your guns, because this game, kind of bafflingly, has completely undone the design from Eternal that encouraged players to use their entire arsenal. No longer does each weapon have its own time to shine, and now we're back closer to Doom 2016, where you can basically use any weapon for any situation. which, to be clear, is not inherently a bad thing, it's really just a difference in the game's design, but it's one that I find kinda puzzling, especially after seeing the director of all these new Doom games, Hugo Martin, in interviews and streams talking about 2016 in this way and how he felt that was a problem that they fixed in Doom Eternal. You know how you could just run around with a super shotgun in 2016 and kill everything? You can literally do that again here in Doom the Dark Ages, and not only is the design not stopping you from doing that, it's kind of encouraging it. Again, it feels like a response to the criticism of Eternal. People didn't like that you had to use everything. They prefer to have their own playstyles, use the weapons they like. So we roll that back for Dark Ages and make a game that is overall simpler to play because you don't have to think about what weapons you're using for the right situation. I mean, there's a little bit of that, like 2016. There are ways in which a weapon might be a little better for this situation versus that one. And of course, me being me, just because I find it fun to play this way, I still tried to use everything as much as I could. It just didn't have the same kind of impact it did in Doom Eternal when I felt like I was being pushed to constantly change up my strategy and the way I play and the weapons I used by the demand of the design. Now in Dark Ages, it felt like I was switching weapons basically arbitrarily just for the sake of using different weapons. I feel like it's just not as strong of a design as what Eternal or even 2016 were doing. Like, that game you could use whatever too, but it felt more meaningful to use different weapons for different situations. Here, it really didn't feel like it mattered, and even ammo wasn't getting in the way and forcing me to switch weapons very much. I barely ever found myself even thinking about ammo while playing this game. And to be fair, I have heard the explanation from director Hugo Martin of why they kind of went for this sort of thing. They didn't want to overload the player with having to think about too many things. With this game having a much larger emphasis on weaving between the enemy attacks, they felt in playtesting that also having to think about using the right tool for the job was a little bit too much, which I did feel a bit on my first playthrough. When I was thinking so much about avoiding and blocking and parrying and all this, I wasn't thinking about what weapons I was using at all. But by the time of my second playthrough, I had gotten more comfortable with that stuff, and I was starting to think about that, and it kind of felt like the game was fighting me when I was trying to use more. And one of the reasons for that is because I'm not even really sure why this was done. Quick weapon switching has been deliberately kind of removed from the game. First of all, something I want to say that really annoyed me my entire time with Doom the Dark Ages, the weapon wheel in this game needs some refinement, because like sometimes it won't come up when I try to use it, or I'll switch to a weapon, but then my character just won't switch, or it just doesn't register sometimes, or something. I don't know, but I had a lot of problems with that. But it's more so the act of switching itself that I take issues with, because for one, it just takes way longer to switch weapons than the previous game. But okay, you don't want players doing like crazy quick switch weapon combos. Sure, I can kinda see that one. But something that I don't understand is why can I no longer like cancel the reload animation of the super shotgun to switch weapons and skip it? That's something that the game prevents you from doing. You fire it and you have to reload before you can switch. Why? I don't really see the benefit to the design of that. I don't need this to be like Eternal, where it's all about doing crazy weapon switch combos, but it could be at least a little bit more like 2016, where you didn't have to do that. You could just use the super shotgun the whole time if you wanted, but you could do that. Why prevent it? I just don't understand. Especially when the ways that weapon switching are prevented aren't even consistent across all of your toolset. Like, you can't cancel reloading with weapon switching or meleeing, but you can cancel it with using the shield and the shield bash, which just doesn't make any sense to me, especially with executions in this game. Glory kills have been changed into just these quick melee animations, which I'm fine with. But what I don't understand is I fire the super shotgun and the enemy's ready to be executed and I'm hitting the button, but you can't do it until you're done reloading. However, I can fire and cancel into a shield bash, which will also trigger an execution. So if I can cancel reloading into an execution via a shield bash, why can't I cancel reloading into an execution via melee, or just melee in general? This is especially weird to me when you bring the shield into play, because it opens up so much potential for cool things that they don't allow you to do. One of the things I find cool about the shield is that it's in your left hand and your guns are in your right hand, and you can kind of use them independently for some things, like the shield throw. You can fire your gun and throw the shield at the same time. Super cool. But it gave me this impression that my left and right arms were independent from each other and they could be doing different things, but that's not the case all of the time. For example, I can't switch weapons and block at the same time, and I don't really understand why. Not being able to shoot and block at the same time makes sense. I'm exchanging offense for defense there. But when I'm weapon switching, I have no offense. There's no reward to that risk. So why is there even risk? Why am I not allowed to block while switching? Especially considering that switching is basically arbitrary as it is. All it really did was kill me a couple of times because I'd run out of ammo with my weapon and automatically switch to another one, and I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't planning to switch weapons at that moment, and I get hit by something because I couldn't parry it or whatever. But my real problem with this whole thing is that if your hands were more independent from each other, then that would open up way more opportunities for cool, creative, player-driven play. I'm imagining a scenario where I'm long distance from an enemy, I shoot a rocket at him, and then I switch to my super shotgun. While I'm switching, I shield bash to close the distance on the enemy. Now my swap is done, and I can fire as soon as I hit him. That's the kind of thing that I think would be really cool that the game just doesn't let you do, and I don't know why. Speaking of stuff that doesn't make sense, one other quick thing I want to point out. When you throw the shield, you can recall it by hitting the same button again, but only after it hits something. If it's just flying through the air, you cannot recall it with the shield throw button. It either has to hit an enemy first or bounce off the floor. I don't understand the purpose of this when at any moment you can recall it by blocking. So it's like, you can't recall the shield without it hitting something unless you want to. It just doesn't make any sense, and it makes me learn all these unnecessary rules that make the game feel overly convoluted. Ironically, this game being simpler than Doom Eternal, I find it more confusing because of things like that. Another aspect of the offense of this game that I don't really care for is the kind of weapon functionality. Now, as I said earlier, I like the weapons in this game, I think they're fun to use, but it's the ways in which they try to make the weapons unique from each other that I feel kind of falls flat. Because the progression of the weapons here, I feel, is pretty different than the previous games, where in those, they changed the way that I would think about using the weapon. A lot of these guns, that doesn't really happen. Take, for example, the Cycler. This is one of your plasma weapons, and it's a big machine gun, does lots of damage. Okay, cool. Now, you upgrade it, and enemies shot with it get an electricity effect applied to them, which makes them take more damage. Cool, but again, I'm thinking about how the previous games worked. I'm like, ooh, I can apply electricity to a guy and then switch to my grenade launcher and it'll take way more damage from it. But of course, because of the long weapon switch, you're kind of discouraged from doing that, and you're even further discouraged from doing that when you more upgrade the Cycler, to the point where it gets an upgrade that it gets a greater damage buff hitting electrified enemies than other weapons do, meaning you should just stay on the Cycler. So now, the way you use this weapon to take full advantage of it is you shoot guys with it so they get electrified, and then you keep shooting them with it. So you just shoot guys with it. That's it. That's all there is to actually using the weapon. That's no different than a completely unupgraded Cycler. The only difference is what happens to the enemies when they get shot. And you can see a lot of that similar design in a lot of these weapons. Like both of the pulverizer weapons, the ones that use skulls as ammo, which is metal as hell, both of them get buffs after doing enough damage with them, where you get a movement speed buff, or extra damage, or healing, or higher rate of fire. But ultimately, what does that come down to? Shoot guys with it until it gets better, and then keep shooting the guys with it. Makes all these weapons just feel like machine guns, just fully automatic weapons where I just fire at things until they die. And all the differences are just a bunch of effects and pretty colors going off that just means they take more damage. The Impaler is another weapon I would point to that's designed like this. One upgrade makes it so that anytime you parry, you get ammo back for it. Another upgrade makes it so that anytime you get ammo for the Impaler, the next shot does more damage. What does that mean in terms of how you actually use the Impaler? Well, it means you shoot guys with it, and you parry attacks, something that you were already doing, because that's how you avoid the attacks in the first place, and then it'll do more damage the next time you shoot the guy with it. So you just use it in the exact same way you were using it before. These upgrades just change what the weapons do to the enemies when they hit them. They don't actually change how you use the weapon, for the most part. There are a couple that are more interesting, like the Shredder. You shoot a guy enough and he gets this effect applied to him where you can hit him with the shield and detonate it. That is more interesting, because now I'm actually thinking about how to use it. Prime him, throw the shield at him, detonate it. While the shield's inside him, prime him again, pull it back to detonate it again. That's pretty cool, and I wish there was more stuff like that with the different weapons. And again, I'm thinking more like the other Doom games. Wouldn't it be cool if I could also detonate the priming with the charge attack on the chain shot? So I set him up with one weapon and then finish him off with the other. You know, all this potential for these effects to create synergies with the guns. There's just nothing like that here for some reason. It really does just boil down to use whatever weapon you like and just shoot the guys with it until they're dead. You see the same exact kind of design with the shield effects here. You eventually get these upgrades to your shield where when you parry an attack, it triggers some big effect, which doesn't change at all how you think about using the shield or the parry or anything. It's just you parry, which you were already going to do anyway, and something happens. What it is that happens feels like it almost doesn't even matter. Does it do damage? Does it stun guys? Does it light them on fire? Whatever, it doesn't really make a difference, which actually encouraged me not to use all the shield effects like I would any other mechanic, just use it all anyway for the sake of it. Because these felt so identical to each other, I just picked which one I thought was the best and just used that the whole game, which feels so wrong for a Doom game when I'm so used to taking advantage of everything. But it really feels like it's the design here. It feels like this game wants you to pick and choose which tools of the arsenal you actually want to engage with. This game is the first one that doesn't give you access to all of your offensive tools at all times. Your shield buffs and your melee weapons, you have to go into a menu to pick which one you want equipped, which I don't really understand. Like, couldn't you put that on, like, the D-pad? Like, right to switch melee weapon, left to switch shield attack? I don't really get that. But that design really feels like it's telling me, pick the melee weapon you want to use. Pick the shield ability you want to use. And along with that, with the way the guns are designed here, feels like it's telling me to pick the 1 or 2 or 3 weapons I like to use and just focus on those things, just level those up, and that's all you need. Which, again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that design, giving players a bit more wiggle room to decide their playstyle and which tools they want to use, but I do feel a bit like players like me, where my playstyle is using everything. I've been a little bit left by the wayside. Now, I know I've had a lot of criticism for Doom the Dark Ages here and its many systems, but I once again want to reiterate, I really like this game. I think it's great. I think it's super fun. Despite all these issues that I have with the design of these systems, I cannot deny that when I just play this game, it is incredibly fun. All the weapons are really cool to use. I like dodging the attacks. I like using the shield. I like mixing in melee attacks. All of the elements here are good. They're fun. There was no part in this game where I was not having a good time. I just see potential in these systems for an even better, even more fun game, and it feels very weird to see id squander so many opportunities to make the combat here more fun and interesting, especially when I think a lot of these are really obvious, and especially after playing Doom Eternal, a game that I felt completely capitalized on all of its design potential. But for now, let's shift gears to talk about another aspect of this game's design that I do think works quite well, the melee. This is basically the equivalent to the chainsaw in this game. It's how you refill your ammo, but instead of one big attack that gives you a ton of ammo, you get many smaller attacks that give you less ammo, depending on the weapon you use. You kind of have a light, medium, heavy here with fist, flail, and mace. And these actually do have a greater amount of differentiation between what they're good for. The fist is better for single target kind of dueling, the flail is good for resource generation, and the mace is good for AoE doing damage to lots of guys in the area around you, which is cool, and it makes me wish that I could switch weapons on the fly to take more advantage of that, but whatever. I would still go into the menu from time to time to switch my weapon depending on the situation, but most of the time I found myself using the flail, as it's really your only good tool for generating armor in this game. You don't have like a solid flamethrower equivalent here. I guess the flail is supposed to be that, but it means if you don't use this thing, you just don't really have armor most of the time. There are other things that can light dudes on fire and generate armor, but you either have to similarly be married to them, where it's what you equip and that's what you use, or it's just one out of your many guns, so I'm not always going to be using that. You don't have a consistent, reliable way to generate armor in this game. You gotta pick something that's gonna do it for you, and for me, it was the flail. It felt like the one that was least intrusive on my options. I guess that's another one of those playstyle things. You could go for an armor-heavy build where you use all the things that generate armor, or you could say, I don't need armor, and not use any of it. But yeah, I'm not really in love with that design, because it means you just get less things to think about if you choose not to engage with armor. But anyway, I do find the melee overall fun, and finding ways to kind of compensate for the lack of weapon switching here did lead me to discover some cool combo stuff you can do. You know, firing your weapon and then canceling it with a shield bash, going into some melee hits, firing again, do another shield bash, do more melee hits. It's pretty cool stuff, undeniably, and you are looking a little bit at your resource situation, like how many melee hits do I have right now? Is my shield bash off cooldown? You know, trying to make those combos kind of dynamically is pretty fun. So that's one part of the game that I think mostly works fairly well, but there is one thing there that I want to talk about, but let's discuss that more so in reference to the shield, because these are the three main pillars of this combat system, right? You got your guns, which are good, but I feel like they could have been done a little bit better. You got the melee, which is pretty solid, and then you have the shield, which I am kind of mixed on. Talked about the shield bash already. That mechanic is super fun. I mean, it's no meat hook, but it's really cool in its own way. Let's talk about the shield throw, though, because this is one that I'm kind of two minds about. The shield throw is primarily used for two things. One is killing fodder, which it's really good at, that's fine. The other one is for locking down enemies. If you hit a bigger enemy with the shield, then it will embed itself in them, and the chainsaw will get going, and they won't be able to move or attack or do anything. Obviously very useful, lets you get tons of free hits in during the fights. Maybe a bit too many. This feels like the stand-in for the Ice Bomb from Doom Eternal, but now it has no cooldown or really any kind of limitation to it other than the fact that you can only lock down a single enemy at once. But here's the thing about the combat design of Doom the Dark Ages. A lot of this game is about fighting one enemy at a time. It's less about those giant group fights where you gotta deal with everything at once. Because of that, a lot of ways you deal with many enemies in this game is break their armor, throw the shield at them, and then just shoot them freely until you can finish them off. Obviously, you can't do this all the time. There are situations where you fight multiple guys at once where things get more interesting, because then it's like, ooh, do I want to lock that guy down? Because then I won't have access to my shield. But a lot of times you are just fighting one guy, which allows you to employ this very simple strategy. And this isn't even one of those things where I'm making the game simple by not acting efficiently. This is efficient play, because since I can't do quick weapon switching, when I fire something and there's a delay in between the shots, I can't do anything else besides throw the shield or do a shield bash, which then has a cooldown, meaning my only other option is shield throw. So it's not even really a decision, it's just a flowchart. This is the correct thing to do when you're just fighting one guy. Not very interesting, and I'll talk more about the nature of this game's combat design and the encounters themselves a little bit later. But of course, we also need to talk about the main function of the shield, blocking and parrying, which again, I'm kind of mixed on. Let's talk about dealing with projectiles first, as this is, I think, where the shield really works well. You can pull up the shield to block red projectiles. If you can't find yourself an opportunity to dodge them, it's a good fallback, but rely on your shield too much and it will eventually break, making you vulnerable if something else is coming at you and you'd need to block it. Now you're screwed. So it gives you a little bit of wiggle room in the dodging and weaving game here, but not so much that you can just rely on it. And when it comes to parrying, some of the enemies will shoot out these big green projectiles, which you can block and shoot them back at them, which I think is very cool and fun. It almost feels a bit in a way like tennis. Like, it's not just defending yourself, I'm actively going out of my way to go catch those green projectiles so I can shoot them back at the enemies. That's really cool. I feel that combos well with this game's emphasis on dodging in between the projectiles, moving to the right spaces. It's real fun. But there is a bit of a dark side to this projectile thing with the shield, because now there are some enemies that kind of break the long-standing rule of these Doom games that you can dodge their attacks. Some enemies now have these machine guns that just basically instantly hit you, and the purpose of this is to encourage you to pull up your shield and close that gap on them. But sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes you got other enemies in the area you have to worry about, and that results in me sometimes finding myself relying on cover in Doom. And of course, you use cover from time to time in the previous games, but I really felt myself doing the exact kind of thing that 2016 was discouraging back when it first came out. Hiding behind a box and like popping out from it to shoot a guy and then getting back in cover. It felt so wrong, so un-Doom. But what really feels very un-Doom is the enemy melee attacks and all the parrying. Now, let me tell you, as an experienced action game veteran, I know my way around a parry, which is honestly kind of a problem for me. I feel like parrying has become a very over-prevalent mechanic that we see way too much of in way too many games, and I would say that Doom the Dark Ages falls into that, because the enemy melee in this game is just a parry fest. It's just parry, parry, parry. Every single thing can be parried, and you really don't have other options besides that. As a result, in these melee fights, you're not thinking very much to avoid getting killed, you're just pressing one button over and over, and I just can't help but imagine a melee system that gave me a few more defensive considerations. Apparently the devs did experiment with non-parryable melee attacks during the game's development, and they felt it was pretty terrible, but I wonder how far that went. Was it just taking these attacks that are meant to be parried and saying, now you can't parry it anymore, because you don't really have any other tools to work with here? If you can't parry an attack, then what else can you do? Block it? You can't really dodge a lot of these attacks because the enemies track you so aggressively. You need to introduce new elements to the system to make that work. Like, I'm imagining, what if we brought back the Marauder mechanic from Doom Eternal? Let's say you give enemies a yellow flash before their melee attack, which means it can't be parried, but maybe you can shoot them with a powerful shot in a precise location before the attack hits you to cut it off. What if enemies had these big ground-shaking stomps that you could jump to avoid? I assume the devs don't want to bring the Eternal Dash back, but what if we brought a different version of that in? You can only do it on the ground, you can only do one of them, and it has this long recovery window after it, so it's not actually a fast way to move around, but it's a fast way to move to get out of the way of unparryable attacks. You know, there's a big startup coming at you, and you backdash. You can't do anything for a brief period after the backdash, but you avoided the hit. Or at the very least, if you reduce the tracking on certain attacks, then say a guy's doing a big vertical swing, I could just move to the side to dodge it. That way there would be more ways to avoid attacks and more things for me to think about. Rather than just waiting for the green flashes and pressing a button, I'm looking at what the enemy's doing and trying to identify what kind of action I'm gonna need to take to avoid that hit. It would make things a lot more thoughtful, though it would only work if all these other things were not also parryable, because if you could just parry all of this stuff instead, then why wouldn't you just do that? This is what I don't like about parries and why I think they're overly prevalent in a lot of action games nowadays, because they boil down the combat to something much simpler than it would be otherwise. It all just comes down to a timing challenge, though not even necessarily that much of one in Doom the Dark Ages, because there's no commitment to the parry. It's just blocking as soon as the attack hits you will give you a parry. There's no like parry animation where you can miss it and be vulnerable for a period, which means a lot of times you can just parry by spamming block, and that will work even with the parry window made as tight as possible. So this whole thing ends up feeling really shallow and very samey, because as I said before, a lot of the combat here is about isolating individual enemies. which means when you fight the same enemy type over and over and over throughout the course of the game, it just feels like you're doing the exact same thing. When I'm fighting this enemy early in the game, how do I fight them? I shoot at them with my gun, doesn't really matter which one, it's arbitrary, and I parry all their attacks until they die. When I fight them later in the game, what do? Shoot them with my gun and parry all their attacks. When I fight them at the end of the game, I shoot them with my gun and parry all their attacks. It's exactly the same every single time. And it's exactly the same across pretty much all of the melee enemy types. This game does not have what Eternal did, where every enemy feels distinct and I fight them all in different ways. You fight this guy by parrying all of his attacks and shooting him. You fight this guy by parrying all of his attacks and shooting him. You fight this guy by parrying all of his attacks and shooting him. The only thing that feels any different to fighting them is the specifics of their attack animations. How long's the startup? How many swings are they gonna do? But that doesn't really change anything meaningful about how I'm fighting. It's the same thing no matter what. I'm just reacting to the startup animations and pressing one button. And again, I feel the need to keep saying this because I'm being so negative. This is fun. This kind of gameplay, parry and attacks, it's fun in any action game. But this feels like just a lesser version of what I could get from a dedicated melee game. And it feels so counter to everything that Doom is as a shooter. What are the two key components of a shooter? Aiming and moving. Yet when you're in these melee fights, you do neither of those things. Your positioning doesn't matter because everything comes down to a timing challenge, just parry or miss the parry. And your aim doesn't really matter either because the enemies basically just stand there. You're not playing a shooter when you're doing the melee combat in Doom the Dark Ages, and it is notably less fun and thought-provoking than when I'm in the big fights with all the projectiles coming at me, and I'm dodging and weaving, and I'm shooting at the guys from long distance. I'm thinking a lot more, paying attention to the entire battlefield, looking for projectiles coming at me from all directions, trying to make sure guys don't get behind me. There's no one button that will just solve the entire situation for me, like you do in these melee duels. And I don't even know why the game puts so much emphasis on one-on-one melee fights when I think by far the melee enemies work best when they're integrated and mixed together with projectile enemies. This makes the gameplay a lot more interesting because now your mind is being divided across two different types of attack you need to avoid. Melee might not require any movement or dodging, but projectile attacks do. They, however, do not require timing to avoid, but melee does. So when you're dealing with both melee and ranged enemies at the same time, you have to focus on two different types of attack that you need to avoid in different ways simultaneously, which is way more fun. Another thing about the melee enemies that I don't love is because parrying is really your only option for defending against their attacks, if you miss a parry and your shield breaks, there's not a whole lot else you can do. Sometimes you can manage to get out of range or something, but most of the time, especially against the Cosmic Barons, if your shield breaks... Another thing worth mentioning is that the player's own melee attacks contribute to this whole not playing a shooter thing, because all the melee attacks lock onto the enemies, so when you're throwing your flail around or you're doing shield bashes or whatever, that's not a shooter either. Which, to be fair, this is Doom the Dark Ages. That's clearly the idea here. We're going back to medieval times, which means swords and shields, melee combat. And so we're trying to incorporate aspects of melee action games together with a shooter, which definitely does have quite a bit of merit to it. The melee here on its own is obviously not as strong as a dedicated melee game, but there are not many games that have this level of melee combat integrated with this level of shooting. That is something you only get in Doom the Dark Ages, and I do think that when those two things are working synergistically together, it's really cool. But this also kind of goes to highlight the weaknesses of the alternate gameplay styles. The mech gameplay is extremely easy because everything can be avoided with the gross amount of iframes you get from your dash. And most of the time, there's literally no shooting here, it's just the melee stuff. You do get this kind of cool little meter resource situation that you can try to use to do special attacks. That's fun enough. Actually, when you go to the sections where you use a gun, it's more simplistic and less fun. But as I said earlier, these mech sequences are very short, the gameplay here is fun enough, and the spectacle is quite effective, so these I don't mind. The dragon, on the other hand, is the epitome of everything that I dislike about the fundamental design ideology of Doom the Dark Ages. You do two major things with the dragon. You fly down corridors, and it's incredibly uninteresting, and then you shoot at things, which once again requires no aiming or moving. You just lock onto the thing, so shooting is basically just making its health bar go down over time, and you just do very simple dodges. For some reason, these alternative gameplay styles hone in on the most shallow part of Doom the Dark Ages gameplay design, yet are even more shallow. I struggle to imagine how these were well received in playtesting by anyone that's a fan of action games, but I suppose these are really here to give you something to do other than just the core gameplay where you're just fighting guys. Because going back to the main gameplay now, apparently one of the criticisms Doom Eternal got was how often it would lock you into an arena and have you fight waves and waves of dudes before you could continue forward. I don't really know why that would be a complaint. There's too much combat in this combat game. It doesn't make any sense to me, but whatever. Seemingly, in response to that, they've kind of done away with those in Doom the Dark Ages and replaced them with a different kind of encounter design. Instead, you have these really big battlefields with enemies spread throughout them, and you kind of have to go around and systematically take out all the enemies to take down the shield that's protecting the leader, and once you've killed enough enemies, you can then go after them and finish off the encounter. And this is fine for the most part, but there are some things about it I find really strange. One of the biggest ones being that most of the enemies are just standing around, like you are the instigator of this fight, and you have to activate the enemies by getting close to them. And I don't mean getting into the fight overall will activate the enemies of that fight. I mean, when you're in the middle of a fight, there'll be enemies on the other side of the arena just like standing around, waiting for you to come to them. And even after you've aggroed a dude, if you feel like, actually I don't want to fight you, you can just walk away from them and go to the other side of the arena, and they'll just go, okay, bye, we'll continue our fight if you decide to come over here again. It is extremely bizarre enemy behavior. The fact that I can just disengage with an enemy whenever I feel like it, and they won't try to do anything about that. But the other thing I find weird about this design is kind of the approach the player needs to take to perform well here, because this game for a long time was kicking my fucking ass. I'm going to talk about difficulties later, but I found myself getting stuck on nearly every single major fight in this game, where it would take me almost like a dozen tries to clear the fight finally. And it didn't feel like that was happening just because the game was difficult. I really felt like I just didn't understand things, and it took me until basically my second playthrough of the game to get to the point like I felt like I actually knew how to play it. What I eventually came to understand is that you really cannot let enemies get behind you in this game. With all the dodging and weaving you need to do between all these projectiles, none of that means anything if a dude gets behind you and he's shooting at you and you can't dodge his stuff because you can't see it. Without the mobility to fly all around the arena and dodge stuff from every angle, you really need to control the battlefield and make sure you have a clear and open space that you can fight from. So a big part of the combat here becomes kind of sweeping through the battlefield and killing everything in the way to create these open areas where you know it's safe behind you and you can just face forward to deal with the enemies ahead of you. If you just run into the battle like you would any other high-speed shooter like this, you are going to get killed. In fact, this is the first of these Doom games where I found myself getting quite frustrated a number of times, where I would just have no idea what killed me. I would die and go, what? What just happened? Can someone please tell me what just happened? And I'd even go through my footage frame by frame, and I'm like, I don't know what just killed me. The thing that made me realize how important it is to clear out the field behind you is the fact that actually the major enemies are not even the biggest threat in these fights. Obviously, they're the ones that can kill you the quickest, but because of that, you end up prioritizing them, and then you become susceptible to the fodder. The fodder is actually the #1 thing I learned to prioritize in Doom the Dark Ages. Forget all these giant cyber demons or whatever. These frickin' soldier guys are the real thing you gotta worry about, because there's so many of them shooting projectiles at you from every direction. It's really not possible to dodge a lot of this stuff. You have to take it out of the fight completely. And, like, you gotta be thorough about this. Even, like, 2 dudes standing behind you as you're fighting a bigger enemy will kill you, for sure. Which actually becomes really annoying, because when the combat becomes about systematically clearing out all the guys so you know the area behind you is safe, when they start spawning guys partway through the fight behind you with no indication of it, it kind of feels a little bit unfair. In the previous Doom games, it was fine to spawn guys wherever because you were constantly moving around and turning in all directions. But in this game, the gameplay design is for you to stand off against these big enemies, so you're not turning around and going all over the place. If they're gonna spawn new dudes in the fight, please spawn them within my field of vision, or at least near the guys that are still alive. Don't spawn them in the areas that, as far as I know, have been made safe. This resulted in me having to start learning, like, when enemies would spawn. You know, when the boss gets down to 50% health, some dudes are gonna spawn and I gotta deal with them. Which again leads to that weirdness of like, oh, I'm fighting the leader. Hold on, I'll be right back. I gotta go kill some basic soldiers first. And this overall encounter design is what I was talking about before, about how you are encouraged to isolate the enemies and fight them one-on-one. When you have these fights where all the big enemies are placed around in all these different areas, why on earth would I aggro multiple of them and have to deal with them at the same time when I can instead carefully work my way through the arena, fighting one guy at a time, eliminating the threats and making the rest of the fight easier? I mean, sometimes they'll throw multiple guys at you in a way you can't circumvent and you do have to fight them all at once, and that's really fun, but outside of being forced to do it, fighting a group of big enemies together is a tactical error. So I'm instead encouraged to do these one-on-one melee fights, which are just parry fests, or lock down a single enemy with the shield and just kill them with very little effort. Which, by the way, it's not just the melee enemies that get really repetitive. Because you fight a lot of stuff one-on-one here, you keep doing the same fights against the ranged enemies over and over too, which is kind of even less interesting because you just lock them down with the shield the whole time. But, here's the thing. I have spent most of my time talking about Dark Ages complaining, but then I'm like, oh, but actually the game's really good. Anyway, back to talking about why this game sucks. But this game doesn't suck, and now I'm gonna talk about why this combat is still great despite all these gripes I have with it. First things first, while many of these elements are simpler than I would prefer, actually playing with them is still fast, intense, hard, and very engaging. Dodging, weaving between all the shots, watching the enemies, looking for the attacks, that's great. The weapons themselves all feel really good to fire, they're fun to use, comboing them together with shield bashes and melees is really cool. Parrying the melee attacks is very satisfying and also very intuitive. All the attack startup animations are really well done. All of that stuff is good. Individually, I wouldn't say that they are necessarily great, but together they are great. When you're doing it all at once, it is very intense. You got a lot to think about, lots going on, but that's not what makes this combat shine to me. The thing that makes these big fights so enjoyable is actually the way in which Dark Ages is most different to the previous 2 Doom games. Those games were primarily about your moment-to-moment decision-making. There's a bunch of stuff in front of me, what am I gonna do about it? This game, those things are a bit simplified, but there is something new taking their place that is also very interesting. Here, things are less about your individual moment-to-moment choices, it's more about your grand strategy. You're not thinking so much about how do I kill all the enemies, but more how do I clear the field. Take a look at this fight. This really illustrates this well. You got a big melee enemy and a big ranged enemy that you're fighting together, and as I said before, that's much more fun and interesting than fighting just a melee enemy. However, it is also much harder than just fighting a melee enemy, and after dying on this fight like 20 times, I developed a strategy that made it much easier, which again was to isolate the enemies. Don't try to fight them together, fight them one at a time. You can see I'm kiting the enemies around, so the faster melee one will catch up to me, fight him for a bit, and when the ranged one shows up, I get out of there so I can pick off the melee one some more until he's out of the picture. In a certain light, I want to criticize this because this is very clearly demonstrating this game's lack of those enemy synergies that we saw in the previous games, where you mix these enemy types together and it creates this whole new combat situation that the player has to figure out how to deal with. In this game, the way you deal with it is you don't deal with it. You don't fight those enemies together. You fight one, then the other. And I've already fought both of these enemies individually before, so I'm just redoing fights, essentially. But the cool strategy here is pulling that off. Taking this encounter where I have to fight two tough enemies at once and making it doable by strategically moving around the arena, corralling the enemies, and putting them into a situation that is much more beneficial and easier for me to deal with. Now we take that to some of those large fights, and rather than looking at how simple it is to just take out the enemies, pay attention to the routing I'm using to take everything out here. One big difference I noticed in Dark Ages compared to the previous Dooms is I felt myself needing to learn the actual arenas themselves and the enemy placements much more. In the last two games, you could just jump into the fight and deal with whatever was there, but here, having that foreknowledge is important because it allows you to plan out how you're going to win this battle. You can't just go in there, you will die, and like I said, you gotta clear some space so you have room to breathe and fight. So what you end up doing is you kind of carve out parts of the battlefield where you say, I'm gonna go over here, take out these enemies, now I got this space to work with. Now I'm going to double back around to this area and take out that enemy. Oh, but the other enemies notice me and they're starting to shoot, so let me see if I can't get around this box and use that to block line of sight so I can isolate this enemy, take him out. Now I can move forward and take out that other enemy. I want to stay out of the middle of the arena because that's where the leader is, so I'm going to move over here instead and I'll work on these things, make sure nothing's getting behind me, look for those priority targets. Oh, there's a guy buffing the other enemies over there. But I can't just go there. I'm going to have to work my way there smartly, so I'm going to go this way, deal with these enemies along the way. You really are kind of taking territory from the enemies, eliminating their forces here, eliminating their forces there, making the battlefield more and more yours, making it easier as you go forward. And while you're thinking about all this, you're still dodging and parrying and using all your tools, you're switching weapons, because I'm low on health and I'm going to use the rocket launcher to heal me a little bit. You know, there's still some of that mixed in there. That is what makes Doom the Dark Ages a kick-ass, super fun shooter. Developing a strategy for how you're going to win the fight, and then executing that strategy while needing to dynamically adjust your plans based on what the enemies do or what spawns. In this game, you are not an unstoppable murder machine. You need to be smart to win the day. That is the thing I was struggling to grasp on my first playthrough of this game, but once I figured that out, it all clicked into place and I started to have a really good time with it. Though if I were to criticize this a little bit, it is hard to develop a good strategy when it's your first time going into the fight, with no foreknowledge of where the enemies are, or exactly how the battlefield is laid out, or how the fight's gonna develop. You kind of just have to wing it, and it sort of feels a bit trial and error. You try something, it doesn't work, you die, and you adjust your strategy until you have something that will work. That process isn't terrible, it's not unfun, but I feel like it would be nice if you could do like a little bit of recon or something so I could see ahead of time what I'm getting myself into and develop some degree of a strategy before jumping into things. Actually, now that I think about it, some fights kind of do that. They give you this high ledge that you can look at the battlefield from before jumping in, but other fights do just throw you right in there, so it's a bit of give and take. And once you really get this part of the game, it makes me wonder if all that extra depth that I'm looking for in the individual systems is not misguided. Perhaps it would be too much to think about and too complicated if I was switching weapons all the time and I had all these different ways of avoiding melee attacks that I had to consider. Put all that on top of needing to think about the larger strategy of winning the overall fight. Maybe that actually would be overwhelming. I have no idea. Maybe this game is in the exact right place it should be. But I don't know, I kind of feel like I'd like to see them at least try to push things a little bit more, because while I do think that this game is really fun, I see potential for an even better Doom the Dark Ages that could exist. But something that is worth mentioning is that for both of the previous Dooms, I was talking about them well after their life was over, after they had many patches and quality of life improvements and adjustments. But I'm playing this game shortly after launch, so this game has not had all the extra passes and polish and adjustments made to it that something like Eternal has, but I'm sure with time they're going to adjust many things about this game and make it even better. Already there have been a number of patches that have made some good changes here and there. That's actually something I really want to praise about id as a developer in general. With single-player games, a lot of teams, you know, they put it out there and then the game is what it is. But id, they really care about making these experiences as good as they possibly can. Like, I've never seen single-player games get balance patches before in this kind of way. And they also go in to adjust the encounters themselves and the enemy placements and stuff. And, like, they're currently working on making the slow-mo a toggle in this game, so you can play it at full speed the whole time, which I think would be really cool, because I do feel it gets in the way of the pacing a little bit. And that's the kind of thing that a lot of other developers might not do, so I really do appreciate that kind of thing a lot. If I could make a request, I would love to see the fast travel from Eternal return, because it's gone in this game. You can't go pick up all the collectibles before you finish the level anymore. What the heck, dude? I'm sure it's something they wanted to do, but it probably had to get cut due to budget or time or something like that. But I would appreciate that getting reinstated in a patch down the road or something. I also appreciate the difficulty sliders here. This is something more and more games are starting to do, and I really like it, because I've seen a number of other Doom heads saying they found Dark Ages pretty easy, but personally, that was not my experience at all. But that's because I was not playing the game on Nightmare. I started on Nightmare, but I too found it too easy, so I went into the sliders and started cranking some things up to make it more difficult. And yeah, as I said, the game was destroying me for a while. I may have cranked things up a little bit too much, but eventually I kind of found a nice balance point where I thought things were pretty good. Here's my settings if you're curious. That's kind of the nature of these systems. There's a bit of a trade-off there. On one hand, it's nice that these sliders are here, because if they weren't, I'd just be stuck playing on Nightmare and finding the game too easy. But also, you kind of have to do a little bit of tweaking that kind of gets in the way of playing the game, because I'm like, okay, let me turn stuff up. Is that too much? Play the game for a bit. Let me adjust that a little bit. Is that okay? Play the game for a bit, adjust the sliders again. And this is an annoying process that nobody actually wants to do. I just want to play a video game, you know? But whatever, I'd rather have it than not. Makes the game more fun. Like I said, everyone else saying the game's too easy was not my experience, so I'd say it's a pretty good feature. You know what else is a good feature in this game? I really gotta talk about this. The load times. Oh my god. I'm convinced that id Tech has got to be the best game engine out there, because these games like run insanely well, and look at the loading of this game. I die, and boom, we're back in already. Like, no load whatsoever. It's crazy impressive. I am an impatient gamer, and I hate waiting. Loading screens have been the bane of video games' existence for a long time, so I really want to say how much I appreciate the work of the tech team over at id. They are incredible. Visuals of this game, I guess that's worth talking about, though I don't really have much to say here. I think the art design, the style, and everything looks super cool. This game is metal as hell. Looks like something that a 13-year-old would draw in his notebook, and it's super awesome. I especially like all the cosmic stuff with Cthulhu later on in the game. That shit's real fun. I'd definitely like to see more of that in the DLC. And I guess worth mentioning, all the mech stuff in this game is pretty sick. You can definitely see the director's history working on Pacific Rim coming through, which I got no complaints about. I love that movie, but I'm like, dude, come on. This one loading screen is just a blatant copy of the poster for Pacific Rim. It's awesome. Though I will say that this game does, once again, sometimes have problems with visibility. I find that enemies blend into the background way too frequently, especially the fodder. Everything in this game is gray and brown with dark, moody lighting, so sometimes that stuff is not as visible as it should be, and that has killed me before. Beyond that, music in this game, unfortunately, gotta say, I don't think it's as strong as the first two, but to be fair, that's kind of a given when you lose Mick Gordon. Same thing happened to Killer Instinct. They had him for the first 2 seasons, but then he was gone for Season 3 to work on Doom, and now he's left this series for the 3rd entry as well, and his music really is next level. Everyone's gonna have a hard time following that up. And yeah, the music in Doom the Dark Age is not bad in any way. It's quite good, but I don't remember any of it after doing 2 playthroughs. Oh yeah, almost forgot. One last thing. This game does not have any other modes. Got no multiplayer, no nothing. Which is fine by me. The campaign has always been the best parts of these games, so I say just focus all of your development resources on that, which is exactly what they did, and it definitely paid off because this game is really long, and it's a great time the whole time. Except when you're riding the dragon. Anyway, there you go. Those are my thoughts on Doom the Dark Ages. Not as strong as the previous game, in my opinion, but still an excellent game in its own right. And I do have a lot of respect for id for trying something so different. Even if some aspects of it don't 100% work for me, I still think that this game is really awesome, and I'd be very happy with just getting more Doom games that are in this same kind of vein of high-energy, awesome action shooters, but all having their own unique elements to them that make them stand out. That is A-okay with me. I think that's a very good way to do a long-running series as opposed to just redoing the same thing over and over and over with every entry. I don't expect or want a Doom the Dark Ages 2, but I also don't want a Doom Eternal 2 either. I want another new Doom game that's doing its own thing. I absolutely think that is the way to go in the future, and can't wait to see what they come up with. Anyway, thanks for watching. Those are my thoughts on the entirety of the new Doom trilogy. Quite the long-haul video this was, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope to see you for more coverage of awesome action games in the future.